when I spoke before about April being an appropriate month for something military, I was looking for a speaker for this month, and I was told that Chris was somewhat cognizant of things military, and asked him if he had a friend who would perhaps come as guest speaker. He said, "I'll get back to you." And came back to me and said, "I'd like to do it." So he's done a great deal of research on something that greatly interested him, and so without further ado, I'll hand you over to Chris.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
It's just been pointed out to me that this club does have a link with the Great War. Ralph Butcher was born in the last year of the Great War, and not too many clubs can say that. What I'd like to do is just do some snippets of the Great War and look at the social and political, some of the social and political impacts on the nation of that war. And the other thing is to spend a bit of time looking at the character of the Australian soldier. It's difficult for us to realise the fervour and spirit that Australians had in 1914 for the Empire, for the mother country. There was no question when Britain was involved in a war, Australia was immediately involved in the war. Australia shared British war aims, and in fact, in many senses, Britain still controlled Australia. The Foreign Office was the major influence on Australian foreign relations. So you see there, the maintenance of the global imperial power of Britain was really important. Protection of the White Australia policy, again extremely important. The guaranteeing of Australian security in the Pacific. If you go around Victoria and elsewhere in Australia, you'll find all these places like Portland, Warrnambool, Port Fairy, Williamstown, all got artillery garrisons. Now, we were mainly concerned then about the Russians or the French, but any European power that wasn't British was always regarded as a bit of a risk. And lastly, the idea, the concept of the defence of democracy against Germany, the fact that here was this great big power, Germany, beating up poor little old Belgium. If we look at the statistics, in August 1914, Australia was barely 5 million people, not quite. The total enlistments were about 420,000 volunteers, and about 330,000 served overseas. Now that is approximately 40% of all the males in the age group 18 to 44 volunteered to serve. Killed in action or died of wounds, 62,000 people. Total casualties, as a proportion, Australia had 65%, UK 51, New Zealand 59, Canada 50. So it was a huge impact on this nation. When you understand that a country of barely 5 million people produced 5 infantry divisions of 20,000 men each, 14 light horse regiments, and a naval battle squadron. The Royal Australian Navy in 1914 was a considerable and strong squadron. It comprised a 12-inch battle cruiser, the Australia, 6 light cruisers, 6-inch cruisers, 6 destroyers, 2 submarines. It was a considerable force which was immediately subsumed into the Royal Navy on the outbreak of war. Some of the political impacts, the enemy within the gates. If you had a German name, or you carried German colours, you were suspect. Many people anglicised their names. The St Kilda Football Club and the St Kilda Cricket Club changed their colours from red, white and black to red, yellow and black. St Kilda Cricket Club has never changed them back. The football club, of course, has. There was a strong anti-German feeling, and there were alien arrests and imprisonments. If you go to Brisbane, many of the streets which had German names, those names were changed to Kitchener, Alexandra and so forth. Censorship was a big issue, and the whole nature of political discourse and how you wrote about it was subject to censorship. Finance. When Australia joined the war, it thought that it would be able to pay for its contribution out of revenue. Very soon it realised it could not. The costs were far more than the revenue, more than 25% more. And it was a difficult financial environment because the states had income taxing power, the Commonwealth had income taxing power, and there was a battle about who was going to pay for all of this. And the fact is they really couldn't. And they had to borrow essentially money from Britain. They also, war bonds were important, and war saving certificates were important. And they raised from war bonds some £250 million. So £250 million in 1918, a lot of money. Metals, wheat, wool, shipping all came under government control. Metals particularly because we had been a strong supplier of metals to Germany pre-war, and immediately that came under control of the federal government. Prices and price fixing were a key area. And then was the issue of the patriotic funds. The losses at Gallipoli showed that we needed a far more systematic mobilisation at the home front. Prior to the First World War, in the Boer War and when the Victorian Naval Contingent went to the Boxer Rebellion, people who were injured came back and they were looked after by families. There was no government support for them. So in the First World War, when the casualty list just started to become so long, the government realised it had to do something. Very little social security. And what happened essentially was that the women of the country started these patriotic funds. There was one in each state. Victoria had the Lady Mayoresses Patriotic League. New South Wales had the Citizen War Chest. Queensland had the Patriotic Fund. The On Active Service Fund in Tasmania, and then they realised this was all too disparate and they consolidated them all in the Australian Comforts Fund. That happened in 1916. It was a very powerful movement. Now, people, in the Second World War, women were mobilised to go into munitions factories and do work that was normally done by men. That didn't happen in the First World War. There weren't many more women employed during the war than had been employed prior to the war. But they did go into the patriotic funds. That was a huge business. And Government House in Melbourne had essentially taken over by the Australian Comfort Funds. Now, propaganda and censorship, Australian wartime propaganda. The media focus was on what was happening in Europe, but the Archibald's Bulletin, the Bulletin magazine, was the most powerful political publication. It started the war as anti-British, anti-imperialist, Republican, but it radically and quickly changed its view to supporting the Australian government. It dominated opinion when people were looking for intelligent comment on politics, life and art. And it advocated a strong Australian national policy. Now these cartoons were produced by Norman Lindsay. Norman Lindsay was a famous artist at the time, and some of his cartoons were so radical that the Australian Cabinet had to tell the Bulletin to tone them down. A couple of figures here. On the left you've got Billy Hughes. Now Billy Hughes, the little digger, he was a member of Federal Parliament from Federation in 1901 till his death, the only person to have served more than 50 years. He represented 6 political parties, leading 5, outlasting 4, and being expelled by 3. He was a guy who knew that politics was power. He was desperate to have conscription for young men to fill the gaps of the horrible losses that were occurring firstly in Gallipoli and then latterly in France. Battalions were down to half their original size. The manning was very low, and he was desperate and tried twice in 1916 and 1917 to get conscription up so that the troops could be reinforced. We live in the electorate of, well, if you're in Bayside, Goldstein. Vera Goldstein, she was the former of the Women's Peace Army. She was ferociously against the idea of conscription. The unions generally were against the idea of conscription. The feelings in the country were very, very strong. This was very, very bitter stuff. And to be successful in a referendum, you have to have a majority of voters in the majority of states. And almost got there, but didn't. Interestingly, the troops overseas voted against conscription. The impact, the long-lasting impact of the conscription issue meant rupture in the Labor Party. I'll come to that later. It meant in the Second World War that we had 2 Australian armies. We had the volunteers, the AIF, they could serve overseas. We had the conscripts, the militia, the ones who were conscripted who could only serve in Australia and its territories. 2 armies was a terrible thing to happen, because you had 2 views, the Chocos, and the money all went to the AIF and not to the AMF. And in the end, they were able to combine them in some way by putting AIF officers in the AMF units. But it was a very non-effective organisation. As I said, this left a huge rift in the ALP. It put them out of office until 1929, when Scullin eventually was elected to power, 2 weeks before the collapse of Wall Street. So the Labor Party in 1929 had a very short tenure. 1932 they were thrown out because of the desperate economic situation. Now I picked an area and I picked some schools to look at in terms of the impact on Australian society. Now I zoned on Geelong in the Western District. Now, there are two major educational institutions in Geelong in the Western District, and they were Geelong Grammar School and Geelong College. Geelong High had only just started in 1911. These schools were considerably smaller than their Melbourne brothers of Wesley, Scotch and Melbourne Grammar. If you look at Geelong Grammar, 417 enlisted, 91 died, which is 1 in 5, 49 won military crosses and 12 won military medals. 52% of the Geelong Grammar enlistees became officers. Geelong College, 508 enlisted, 97 died, again 1 in 5. These people brought their all to the war effort. Geelong Grammar was seen as the most empire conscious of all schools. Captain Percy Chirnside, who in 1889 had raised his own battalion of Victorian Horse Artillery, he brought his little private army with him to the war. This is the 1913 Geelong Grammar 8. Of these 9 people, only 2 survived the war. 3 won military crosses, 4 served in British regiments. It's interesting that at the Geelong Grammar, a third served in British regiments, either because they were at Oxford or Cambridge when the war broke out, or alternatively they went to serve in the father's regiment. 4 were wounded at Gallipoli. So it was a terrible toll on the region that these young men of talent from both college and Geelong Grammar were lost to the district, and many rural properties lost their natural heir in terms of running those properties. Only disciplined soldiers are ready for war. Independent thinking is not to be encouraged in a professional army. It's a form of mutiny. Obedience is the supreme virtue. That was not the Australian army. That was not the Australian way of doing things. The Australian was independent in spirit, and in fact he was a natural and resourceful fighter. He was slovenly, he was irreverent, he didn't salute, he was disrespectful of ordained authority, and he respected only authority that he saw as being earned. He was very difficult to control, very individualistic. One thing he had in his advantage was that after the Boer War, the Australian government determined that they were not going to have any other soldiers executed out of for whatever offence the British thought that should carry the capital sentence. And the Australian Governor-General had to confirm all sentences passed by courts martial, and he did not endorse any death sentence. Australian was an interesting soldier. So this is meant to be a true story, but the commander of the Australian Corps up till 1918 was General Birdwood. And he and an entourage of staff officers were inspecting the trenches. And they passed by 2 daisy diggers leaning on tools in trenching. fags out of the mouth, who did not move as this whole mob of officers passed by, and a brigade major was sent back to castigate these two dozy diggers. And don't you realise this is your commanding general, General Birdwood? One of the dozy diggers looked at the other and said, Birdwood? Birdwood? Why doesn't he have a feather up his arse like any other Birdwood? True. Australians were pretty unruly. They burnt down the Wassa, that's the red light district of Cairo. They threw all the whores out first and then the pimps after them, and they burnt the place down. The police could not control them. If they thought they'd been dudded, they really served it out. And they were, the British idea of spit and polish was not their idea. Haig and others thought that they were so ill-disciplined, but they had to recognise that they were also great fighters. And any time there was a breach in the line, they moved an Australian in to plug it. Now the Australian government hated the idea of its troops being used to plug holes. It wanted them all to fight together, and didn't achieve that till 1918. One of the important things about the Australian soldier was that the officers explained extensively to their men the purpose of the action they're about to engage. The soldiers knew the strategy, they knew what they were required to do, and even if cut off, they knew how to react to that. Unlike their British colleagues, common Australian soldiers were not treated like ignorant donkeys, but like the individuals who will function better in a team when they know their collective aim. Monash said, very much and very stupid comment has been made about the discipline of the Australian soldier. That was because the very conception and purpose of discipline has been misunderstood. It is, after all, only a means to an end, and that end is the power to secure coordinated actions among a large number of individuals for the achievement of a definite purpose. It does not mean lip service, nor obsequious homage to superiors, nor servile observance of focuses and customs, nor a suppression of individuality. The Australian Army is proof that individualism is the best and not the worst foundation upon which to build up collective discipline. So that was the view. The Australians spent much time trying to disrupt British spark, but let me also say that by the end of the war, 9 men in 1,000 in the Australian Army were in prison. Compared to the UK, New Zealand, Canada, they were all at 1.4%. So the boys did play up. There's a little excerpt. This is from a British subaltern holding a trench and desperately waiting reinforcements. Suddenly, to my surprise, I heard voices behind me, and I looked back, and there were these 3 very tall figures, and one was actually smoking. I could hardly speak for astonishment. I said, "Who the hell are you? Put that cigarette, you'll draw fire." He just looked at me and said, "Well, come to that, who are you?" I said, "I'm Lieutenant King of the 2nd 5th East Lancaster Regiment." To which he said, "Well, we're Aussies, chum, and we've come to relieve you." And they jumped down into the shell hole. Well, naturally, we were all delighted. But of course, there are certain formalities you've always got to carry out when you hand over. And I was a bit worried about that, so I explained, "There are no trenches to hand here, no rations, no ammunition. But I've got a map. "Do you need a map reference?" He said, "Never mind about that, chum, just fuck off." They didn't seem to be a bit bothered. The last time I saw them, they're squatting down, rifles over their shoulders, and they were smoking. All three of them just didn't care. And that was the attitude that they had. So that's really all I've got to say. But it's been an interesting exercise of looking at some of the ways in which people then interact with others.
Very well put together, Chris, because I don't know if any of you have read Geoffrey Blaney's books. There's a couple of the great historian. One is called The Short History of the World. The other one's called The Short History of the 20th Century. And they're both great reads. But Chris, I'd put The Short History of World War I right up there with Geoffrey Blaney. That was very informative. Thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions of Chris? With all the research he's done, there's probably a lot more information. Yes.
Chris, I was intrigued when you said how many of the Geelong College and Grammar enlisted. They were the older boys at the age of 18, 17 or 18. What was the age, you know?
Well, these schools tended to have people who went on beyond merit certificate to matriculation, tended to go to matriculation. So they would have been usually 17, 18.
Yeah.
So I think that's the difference, because in most other schools, you could have any job if you had merit certificate, which is intermediate. Most people didn't have merit certificate. So this was, in many ways, they were the top echelon of people with potential.
Any other questions? Good. A couple more.
Thank you. Chris, you've done a lot of research, and at the moment I am researching family history just as a matter of interest, and particularly in the First World War situation. My mother's family all came from the Euroa area, and she and her sisters had all been educated at Tallangatta Convent, because that was the best education in the area prior to the outbreak of war. I could never understand growing up, and unfortunately my mother died fairly early in my life, why she was so violently anti-Catholic, having been given the opportunity of the education that she had. And of course the answer is, as you put up on the screen, Archbishop Mannix, because it certainly just divided the township of Euroa, as my researchers discovered, in half, on those for king and country and those opposed to the mobilisation of forces. So I just think it was remarkable how it carried on for so many years afterwards. It never left her. So it must have been pounded into them at the time.
Well, I mean, it was a huge issue, and I mean, Mannix was perceived to be anti-conscription because of a concern that Australian troops might be used in Ireland. And so, but that wasn't necessarily representative of the Catholic Church elsewhere in the country. There were strong elements of pro-conscription elsewhere. And the point you made about the convent is that people don't realise now that high schools didn't exist in Victoria till, I think, Melbourne High and what is now McRobb High started at about 1905, they were the first, and then there were a few more in 1908, and then 1911 there were more again, but it was a long time. I mean, the churches really gave the education to the masses in Victoria, in Australia.
Thank you.
Chris, great. You mentioned the war bonds. were the people subscribing, were they paid interest? And when did they get their capital back, I wonder?
I don't know, but they would have waited a long time to get their capital back. I mean, Australia really struggled financially after the First World War, so it would have been quite a while.
Anyone
Can I
else?
just make a comment about war bonds? I did own some, very small amount, and I got my money back, no interest.
There we are.
Can I
again?
ask you a question not directly related to what you just said, but dare you venture your views on what would happen if there was, sadly, an outbreak of war? Would we get volunteers?
Well, it's a different world now, isn't it? I mean, I talk about those statistics. 1 in 5 died. 2 in 5 had were wounded in one way or another. But the reality is that the other 2 in 5 probably had psychotic issues, PTSD and all the rest of it, which weren't recognised. If you were shell-shocked, you were treated in some instances as a malingerer. So I think the world's changed now. I mean, actions like Afghanistan did bring volunteers, but when you see the impact on men now who have returned, it would be, you'd think twice about it all, I think, to volunteer. I think it'd be very hard to maintain an army in a major conflict without conscription.
Yes, one more. Jim.
Chris, maybe a little bit off topic, although it is on the First World War. What I've never really been able to understand as to why it occurred in the first place. We all know that how the Second World War came about, but it seems so obscure as to how the First World War broke out. We know that Germany attacked France via Belgium, and that's what triggered it, but why did they do so? What were they after? Were they after territory, after status, European domination? It's never been clear as to why it actually occurred. There's no real conflict they wanted to resolve. Why did it happen?
Well, there's a lot of history there, and the linkages between nations. I mean, Germany was flexing its muscles, building up a navy to challenge Great Britain. The Russians were concerned about the Germans. The Russians were linked to the Serbians. The Serbians hated the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was linked to the Germans. France then, England and France had fought for centuries, but they decided to link, and France linked with Russia first, and then England linked with France, and when the fuse was lit, it all went up. So it's just history and how people, I think at Queen Victoria's funeral, the mourners included her grandchildren, the Kaiser, Tsar Nicholas, Edward VIII. They were all intermarried, but that didn't stop it. And of course the king rapidly changed his name from Saxe-Coburg or whatever to Windsor. But many people Monash had a concerted campaign by some, including Murdoch and including Bean, because he was German and Jewish. So that's how the world goes. Light a fuse and away it goes. It's unstoppable.
Chris, you just mentioned Monash. I think he's one of the greatest Australians we've ever had. What's your opinion?
Oh, absolutely brilliant. You had a war, a new industrial war that was quite unlike the Boer War or wars previously. You were now being able to bring industrial production in a massive way to the battlefront. The British generals generally, Gough and others, and Rawlinson, They were cavalry generals. They were, in a way, still trying to adjust from the last war to this war. Their answer was to throw men at the problem, and they did. They threw men at the problem. I'll tell you a story about Fromelles, which was the first action that the Australians had in France after they'd come from Gallipoli to Egypt and rested, and then they went to France. The Australian brigade, or one of the Australian brigades in Fromelles, was Pompey Elliott's 13th Brigade, and they were ordered, as it was a diversionary attack, because I wanted to take pressure off the French. He was ordered to attack Fromelles, and he said, "This is lunacy," and he convinced the British staff, Sir Richard Hakins's staff, that this was lunacy, but Hakins said the Australians have to be blooded. So the Australians were indeed blooded. In that one night, the casualties was 5,523, of which 1,200 died. So when later in the war, when the British wanted to order Australians to do things, the Australians were much more concerned. In one case, Glasgow, who was commander of a brigade at Village Breton, he was ordered to do this attack at a particular time. He said, "Sir, tell us what you want us to do, but let us plan it ourselves." And that's what they weren't going to be pushed into doing stupid things like the Brits.
Very good.
Thank you, Chris, once again, and well answered all the questions as well. And gentlemen, please join with me in thanking Chris.